No mai haere mai, inga reo, ina mana, inga waka, inga karangatanga, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. So my name is Nick Smith, for those who don't know me, and I'm the Vice-Chancellor here at Victoria University Te Herenga Waka, and it's my enormous pleasure this evening to welcome you all to the university, and particularly to the inaugural lecture of Professor Rebecca Priestley, who is the Professor of Science in Society. And these are always wonderful events for our university community, and I always look forward to them. But I've been particularly looking forward to this event because I think, Rebecca is the embodiment of what I think of as the Renaissance academic. She started at this university with a Bachelor of Science in Geology in the very early 90s, which was followed by an honours degree. And then almost 3 decades later, bookended that with a Master of Arts in Creative Writing with distinction in 2018. In between, she really did something quite extraordinary for anyone who's ever done a PhD, was that she did a PhD while also having 3 children and writing 2 books. I can only imagine what that would have been like. I have only 2/3 of those children and none of those books. But she did that with part-time. She suspended at periods, but finished. And then I think, again in an extraordinary way, accelerated her career so that a mere 12 years later, here she is as a full professor, the highest academic honour of this institution. Her teaching and writing have influenced both in the academic and scholarly realm and also in the public, where I think increasingly it's incredibly important for both the social licence of our academics and the social licence of our university. Her primary academic discipline is the history of science, with a focus on science in New Zealand and Antarctica. But she also aims to educate the public in the climate emergency, the realities and challenges of sea level rise in Aotearoa, and the way that scientists work and contribute on problems. Trained in earth sciences and history of sciences and creative writing, that is a very powerful trilogy to bring to what I think we would all understand as a very much an existential problem for ourselves, for the next generations, for the country and for the planet as a whole. As an interdisciplinary scholar and a creative non-fiction writer, she works at the boundaries between science and humanities, collaborating with scientists, social scientists, science communicators, and artists. This is a career which has been built on those two different spheres. Before her academic career, she had more than 20 years in science communication in Aotearoa, and following that, she co-founded with Ryan Salmon the Science and Society and Science Communication program here, which as of last year is now a full School of Science and Society. In addition to the 2 books she wrote while doing her PhD, she has written 5 more. She's contributed multi-million dollars of research funding through 6 different projects. She's an investigator in how our Changing Coast research program, and she also co-leads Te Puna Matatini's funded Science and Statistics and Media project with our own Professor Richard Arnold. She's been in Antarctica 3 times on media and education and outreach programs, and has filled a wide array of leadership roles in this university. And as she has just told me, she has also done the most important role in this whole university, which was as the manager of the bar during her student years. There was an equally long list of awards, and I am going to read them because I am concerned that Rebecca will be too modest to highlight them herself. She has received the Prime Minister's Science Communication Prize in 2016. She's a companion of the Royal Society. She's a member of the Melting Ice Rising Seas team that won the Prime Minister's Science Prize in 2020. She has the New Zealand Science Book Prize in 2008. And her books End Times last year and 15 Million Years on Antarctica were longlisted for the Ockham New Zealand Book Awards. In tonight's lecture, I'm told there will be humour, I'm told there will be profanity, and that will be interlaced with big questions. questions that apparently keep Rebecca up at night. Through the disciplines of science communication, history, science, and creative non-fiction. Questions of how we have engaged with COVID-19 pandemic, what the nuclear histories of New Zealand and Antarctica are, climate change and sea level rise, the way that writing has given her a way to explore and respond to her anxieties for the future. It is my great pleasure to introduce Professor Rebecca Priestley.
Ngā mihi, Vice-Chancellor, tēnā koutou katoa, ngā mihi nui kia koutou. Thank you all for coming. I feel quite exhausted after that introduction. In particular, thanks to my family, my colleagues from the School of Science and Society, my writer friends, and the people who over the years have helped me by giving me a job or a place to work. And just thinking about the people from this university, that would be Professors Mike Crozier, Charles Doherty, David Bibby, David Harper, as well as the late Paul Callaghan and Lydia Weavers. In this lecture, I'm going to talk a bit about my academic journey, I guess, but also hopefully share some interesting things about our history and the world we live in today. My preferred mode of communication is writing, but after more than 10 years as an academic, I've got used to speaking in front of a crowd, and perhaps it's in my blood. I do come from a long line of educators, mostly school teachers, many of whom wore robes like this to teach in the classroom every day. And there are also many thespians in my family. There's definitely a performance aspect to this event with dress-ups and all. So I don't take it for granted that I have got to this position of being a professor. When I studied here in the late 1980s as an undergraduate in the Research School of Earth Sciences, not only were there no women professors, there were no women academics in the school at all. And I think in the 5 years I spent getting a BSc honours, I only ever had 2 female lecturers, and they were Gillian Turner in physics and Kath Wallace in environmental economics. So I appreciate that times have changed, though there's still a way to go until the professoriate represents the society we live in. I want to start by talking about what shaped me and my research direction. So I was born in 1967 in the post-war period that Marxist historian Eric Hobsbawm called the Golden Age. But by the time I was 5, we were out of the Golden Age and into the crisis decades, and that's the world that I grew up in. So who remembers the 1980s? Yeah? Pretty much everyone here. So I started school in 1980, high school. And while some of the music was good, I remember the 1980s as being pretty grim. There was a global economic recession. We had rising unemployment rates, rising inflation, mortgage rates reached 20% or more. And the backdrop to all of this was the Cold War and this pervasive fear of nuclear war. Most of the tension was in the Northern Hemisphere, but American nuclear warships were visiting our harbours, and France was testing nuclear weapons in the South Pacific. In 1984, the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists moved their doomsday clock forward to 3 minutes to midnight, the closest it had been since 1953. Then in 1985, French agents bombed the Rainbow Warrior in Auckland. It was also an unashamedly racist world. South Africa was living under apartheid, and the Springbok tour of 1981 divided our nation. As part of her protest, my Aunt Dinah, who's here today, founded an organisation called WAR, or Women Against Rugby, with a manifesto that included telling women not to wash their sons' and husbands' rugby jerseys. I marched with friends and family in protest at the tour, but my grandmother went one step further and was arrested for running onto the tarmac at Wellington Airport to disrupt a plane that was carrying the Springbok players. The next day's newspaper headline read, "Woman 72 jailed in filthy cell." So as a teenager, I was anxious and confused and often angry, while the people around me were speaking out against the things that were wrong about the world. It was clear that the people in charge, some of them on the screen here, were doing a crappy job of running things, and it was hard to have a positive vision of the future. I wonder if any of that feels familiar now. So through the 1980s, most of us thought that nuclear war was a matter of when rather than if. At first, we thought that here in Aotearoa, far away from any Northern Hemisphere conflict, we would survive. But after our whole senior year at high school, we got bused to the movies to see the film the day after, we realised we wouldn't be okay. The planet would fall into a nuclear winter, and if the radiation didn't get us, we'd be unable to grow food and we would all starve. I hope that young people are feeling okay here. And that was just one of the movies or TV shows that had a real impression on me. There was also Sleeping Dogs, which my mother took me to see at the movies when I was just 10 years old. Thanks, Mum. And Survivors, a 1970s British show which my mother watched on TV at about the same time. Anyone else have the urge to rewatch that during the first COVID lockdown? So thanks to my husband, Jonathan, we had the boxed set on DVD. So the way that my friend Maz and I responded to the fears and anxieties of the 1980s and our very liberal, progressive upbringings was first of all to listen to noisy punk music and stomp around wearing boots and army surplus gear. But then we completely pivoted to become born-again Christians, which is something I've written about in my most recent book, which, like my lecture, is called End Times. In retrospect, it was a safe refuge for us, a way of adopting a narrative that seemed to have the answers to everything, and it gave us a community to belong to, for a short time anyway. We lasted 2 years before we recognised the anti-gay, anti-women attitudes of the church and left. So at university, I did a BSc in geology and then an honours year in physical geography. I loved learning to read the rocks and the landscape and to make a story out of it, to explain how things got to be the way they were. But look how miserable I was. That's me trying to operate a magnetometer in a field somewhere out in the Wairarapa. I was interested in learning what science told us about the world, but not really doing the science myself. So I left uni with a BSc honours. And then maybe there was another factor at play. My father was a professor, one of those old school professors with a tweed jacket with leather elbow patches. He was a seismic engineer and he worked in New Zealand, Italy and the US. And he had started calling me Dr. Priestley when I was about 3 years old. And I think it's perhaps my rebellion against that parental expectation that meant I took a long time to come back to academia. I had written for Salient as a student. I had always wanted to be a writer. But I then spent a decade working in the field now known as science communication, before I went to a career counsellor who took me through a card sorting exercise at the end of which there was one clear career path, academic. This reminded me that I had always intended to go back to university to do a PhD. I'd just never been sure what in. So after lots of Googling, I discovered there was a discipline called History of Science. And after a chance meeting with Rob Goldblatt, who was a family friend, I learned that a postgrad history and philosophy of science program was starting up at the University of Canterbury. So I started my History of Science PhD in 2001, looking at New Zealand's nuclear history, which I did remotely and part-time while having 3 children in the picture here, 2 of which are here tonight, and writing 2 books. Then got that academic position here, initially fixed term in 2013. So now, as an interdisciplinary researcher and writer with 4 degrees in 4 different disciplines and half a BA in another discipline, and they might seem disparate, but I think they're all strongly narrative disciplines. I do sometimes struggle to define what discipline I'm in or what has informed the path that I've taken. But when I look back at my academic career from the start of my PhD to now and the sorts of things that I've been interested in studying, it's pretty clear to me that what I've been doing is anxiety-led research. So I'm going to break this talk up to cover some of the things that over the years have caused me a lot of anxiety and have dictated my research and writing focus. And I'm going to start by talking about nuclear histories. So what my generation knew about New Zealand's nuclear history was that we were nuclear free. I'd marched against visits from American nuclear warships, grown up with the threat of nuclear war, was outraged at the bombing of the Rainbow Warrior. But after my geology degree, I did some contract work for GNS Science, and part of this Crown Research Institute was the former Institute of Nuclear Sciences, an organisation set up in 1958 as a branch of the Department of Scientific and Industrial Research, or DSIR. It was on the hill above the Gracefield Science Campus, and when I had to get a taxi there from Petone Railway Station, I learned that the taxi drivers called it the bomb factory. And this was weird and fascinating, and I learned that there was a longer and not very well-known history about New Zealand's nuclear past, and that's the story that my PhD thesis and the subsequent book, Mad on Radium, told. This topic was super interesting to me, and it allowed me to delve into something that I used to find really scary. So now I'll share a bit about New Zealand's nuclear history. So New Zealand's early involvement with the nuclear age came because of what Ross Galbraith has called the Rutherford connection. So Ernest Rutherford had died in 1937, but come the start of the Second World War, he was still a hugely respected Nobel Prize-winning scientist for his work on radiation and the atom. The head of New Zealand's DSIR, Ernest Marsden, had been a student of Rutherford's in the UK, where he was involved in the famous experiment from which Rutherford deduced the structure of the atom. So come the Second World War and the very secret British and US plans to build an atomic bomb, Marsden was well connected enough to find out what was going on. He organised a team of DSIR physicists to start making Geiger counters. And in late 1944, two teams of geologists and physicists, each with a portable Geiger counter, began a secret exploration of promising parts of the South Island, from Farewell Spit to Stewart Island. They were looking for uranium, which was suddenly a very useful mineral. And this was the first of a series of uranium surveys, including a ship-based exploration of the West Coast beaches and Fiordland. Marsden also got a group of young New Zealand physicists and engineers involved on the Manhattan Project to build an atomic bomb, and a parallel project in Montreal, Canada, to build the first nuclear power plant. In August 1945, following the dropping of nuclear weapons on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, New Zealand newspaper editorials expressed how proud they were of the work our boys had done. And the UK congratulated New Zealand, acknowledging the foundations of this great achievement came from Rutherford's own work. A few months later, New Zealand's Atomic Energy Act was passed to give the state full control over uranium and other radioactive elements. So there was a general, very positive attitude towards both nuclear weapons, they had ended the war, and nuclear power, which promised a cheap and bountiful supply of electricity for our growing populations. The 1950s were marked by excitement about the possibilities of nuclear energy, but also the beginning of the nuclear arms race, with the US, Soviet Union, and the UK developing fission bombs, and then the much more powerful fusion or hydrogen bombs. In New Zealand, the UK Atomic Energy Authority partnered with our government on a project to harness the energy of the Wairakei geothermal field to produce electricity for local consumption and heavy water for use in the British nuclear program, though the heavy water part of the project was eventually abandoned. The 1950s also saw the beginning of civil defence in New Zealand, and preparedness for a nuclear attack was top priority. A 1959 booklet, Civil Defence in New Zealand, declared the most likely targets to be Auckland, Christchurch, Dunedin, and Wellington, which you can see in this map, showing fallout zones after a bomb dropped on Parliament, and we're not on a very good spot right here. Yeah. So while evacuation of potential targets was considered the civil defence priority in a nuclear attack, the booklet also mentioned the need for fallout shelters of relatively simple types, such as slit trenches and Anderson-type frames, which just reminds me of the Raymond Briggs book, When the Wind Blows, where Jim Bloggs prepares for a nuclear attack by making an Anderson shelter in the living room out of a door and some heavy cushions. And I think a generation of children were just terrorised by this book, When the Wind Blows. As a comic by the same author as Fungus the Bogeyman, it was very appealing to pick up and open, but it had a very dark story. But on a more positive note, kind of, in 1954, the New Zealand government published a guide to prospecting for radioactive minerals. Hundreds of eager prospectors bought or made their own Geiger counters and began exploring. Then one Sunday afternoon, in November 1955, these two veteran prospectors, Fred Casson and Charles Jacobson, were returning home after a day prospecting in the hills above the Buller Gorge. As their story goes, they had finished the day with a few drinks in the Berlin's hotel, and needing to relieve themselves on the drive home, pulled the truck over to the side of the road next to Batty Creek. Jacobson put his Geiger counter on the rock face, and the counter ticked wildly, the needle going off the scale, he said. The excited pair returned to the hotel to spend the night, returning the next morning to gather rock samples. When they arrived in Wellington, armed with samples of the radioactive rock, there was great excitement, especially when the Geological Survey confirmed the rock contained twice as much uranium as the rock in the Rum Jungle uranium mine in Australia. So for a brief time, the West Coast swelled in the grip of a uranium rush, the hills and river valleys filled with prospectors eager for a find of the ore to fuel the developing United Kingdom and United States nuclear program. A uranium strike was also a really exciting prospect for New Zealand because a local uranium source would make nuclear power all the more affordable. Soon there were 6 reported uranium finds and a new era of hope and prosperity on the West Coast. Hotels made presents of radioactive rock fragments to passing guests, and some entrepreneur began selling uranium ice cream, which did not contain any uranium. And the Berlin's Hotel had its busiest afternoon's trade since the gold rush. Prospecting continued through the 50s, but enough highly concentrated uranium in one place to make commercial extraction of it viable was never found. 1958 saw the establishment of the DSIR Institute of Nuclear Sciences and the start of a long but ultimately unsuccessful campaign to set up a nuclear reactor at the Institute's site at Gracefield, the place that nevertheless became known as the bomb factory. The 1960s began with a goodwill visit of a nuclear submarine, the USS Halibut, which drew crowds, not in protest, but to marvel at this sleek and sophisticated manifestation of the nuclear age. There had been excitement about the possibility of nuclear power since it began being used to generate electricity in the UK in the 1950s, and by 1964 it had made it onto New Zealand's power plan. A local manpower committee sent engineers to the UK to train in nuclear engineering, and a siting committee selected a site on the Kaipara Harbour as the best location to serve the demand for electricity from the growing population of Auckland. With renewed pressure on the need for uranium as fuel for the nuclear power plant, government-funded uranium prospecting recommenced. Meanwhile, atmospheric testing of nuclear weapons was pumping radioactive elements into the stratosphere, from where they were distributed around the world, eventually falling out to the ground. The fallout products, strontium-90 and cesium-137, for example, each with a half-life of about 30 years, got into the air, to the soil, from the soil to the grass, into the cows who ate the grass, and from the cow's milk into the bones of the babies and children who drank the milk. Strontium and cesium levels were highest in 1965, 2 years before I was born. The public mood turned in the 1970s with growing protests against French nuclear testing. See, there's that classic line on one of the banners there, we don't pee in the Atlantic, so don't shit up our Pacific, and against American nuclear warship visits. When the USS Truxtun visited Wellington in 1976, it was not only the protesters who got into action. Following the Civil Defence Plan in preparation for an accident or even a nuclear strike, The National Radiation Laboratory installed radiation monitoring devices at 20 sites around Wellington Harbour. The day before the ship arrived, the National Civil Defence Nerve Centre was activated under Parliament buildings. Part of the requirement for relaxed readiness was having a stock of protective clothing, individual dosimeters, respirators, and potassium iodine tablets, which could protect the thyroid gland from radioactive iodine to administer in case of a nuclear incident. 1978 marked the report of the Royal Commission of Inquiry into Nuclear Power Generation in New Zealand. There was an urgent need for new electricity generating options, and the purpose of the inquiry was to weigh up nuclear power against different power generating options. But by the time they came to report, the Maui gas field had been discovered and Huntly's coal reserves had been found to be bigger than previously known. There was now no need for nuclear power. And in the Commission's report, they described the history of nuclear power in New Zealand as one of official enthusiasm, early public acceptance or apathy, and then a rising opposition. They concluded that nuclear power is not justified for New Zealand until about the turn of the century, or perhaps even later. Meanwhile, another threat was looming. Atmospheric chemists first suggested in 1982 that there was a possibility of climate change induced by nuclear war. They calculated that the fires that would burn for weeks after a nuclear war would produce a thick layer of smoke that would reduce the amount of sunlight that would reach the Earth's surface and totally eliminate agricultural production in the Northern Hemisphere. A subsequent study, the first to use the phrase nuclear winter, found that a global nuclear war could lead to sub-freezing land temperatures in continental areas down to minus 25 degrees C for many months. And as it would affect the Southern Hemisphere as well as the Northern Hemisphere, this matter really caught the attention of the New Zealand media. There were also these fun books to read. New Zealand After Nuclear War, published in 1987, was a national case study of the effect on New Zealand of a large-scale nuclear war in the Northern Hemisphere. And this nuclear survival manual was grim, really an every man for himself kind of survivalist's guide to life after nuclear war. But what the 1980s are most well known for is our nuclear-free policy. So in 1985, the Labour government's nuclear-free policy was put into action when David Lange's Labour government refused entry to a US warship that could neither confirm or deny if it was carrying nuclear weapons. The US retaliated by kicking New Zealand out of the ANZUS agreement, the Australia, New Zealand and US military alliance. Then French agents bombed the Rainbow Warrior. Later that year, Labour won the general election on a nuclear-free platform, and in 1987, the New Zealand Nuclear-Free Zone, Disarmament and Arms Control Act was passed. So this is a research interest that started with my PhD and has continued on with a co-edited book about the impact of the Fukushima nuclear disaster on attitudes to nuclear power around the world, and then some work I'm doing at the moment for the Waitangi Tribunal on Māori veterans' exposure to radiation. And this exposure came from three places, from Operation Grapple, where New Zealand sent 2 Navy ships to provide weather information for the British H-bomb tests in 1957 and 58, in Antarctica, where the US operated a nuclear power station at McMurdo from 1962 to 1972, and on Operation Pallister, which was the 1973 protest voyage of the HMNZS Otago and Canterbury, who sailed to Mururoa to protest against French nuclear testing. But at some time in my 20s, the thing that began eclipsing nuclear war as my number one anxiety was climate change. It was in the 3rd year of my Earth Sciences degree when the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, first met in 1988. I graduated in 1990, the same year that IPCC released its first report, identifying climate change as one of the most important long-term threats to humanity. In my geology classes, I had gained an understanding of the ways the Earth's climate had changed in response to natural phenomena in the past. I'd learned about contemporary climate change in physical geography classes with Mike Crozier and in my honours year in a course with Jim Salinger on climatology. And for a while, climate change felt like something that might happen in the future, but we were going to do something to stop it. In 2010, when I finished my PhD, I started writing a regular science column for the Listener magazine. And I wrote a lot about climate change and Antarctic ice melt and the scientists who studied these things, many of them from our Antarctic Research Centre here. And for a while, we really believed that if only people understood what we knew about climate change and what we needed to do to turn things around, then everything would be okay. I started my academic career here in 2013, and with Rhiannon Salmon started a teaching program we initially called Science in Context. My PhD was in history of science, and I started a history of science course, but there was a lot of interest in my science communication background, and Rhiannon and I found ourselves invited, encouraged, coerced even, into writing papers about science communication, teaching a new course in science communication, and working with scientists on large projects that wanted a science communication or public engagement component. I went to a lot of conferences that first year, I guess trying to find out where I fitted in. With my strong science background, I didn't really fit in history. With my history background, I didn't really fit in science communication. And finally, I went to an STS, or Science and Technology Studies conference in Singapore. In a way, they felt like my people. They were certainly concerned about the same issues. But at paper after paper, people were talking about Derrida and Foucault and things like liminal spaces and boundary objects, in a way that made it really clear that everyone should be familiar with these scholars and these terms. And I realized I had a completely different vocabulary, the language of science, where spaces and objects were actual things in the physical world. And I felt more comfortable with disciplines where understanding the world started with getting right out in the midst of things, usually in a pair of shorts and some tramping boots. I enjoyed the laughs from my colleagues there. Yeah. So what I did find over time is that to me, the disciplinal methods that I use to approach a topic is not what connects me or interests me with others. It's the topic itself. I'm much more interested in meeting with people from other disciplines who are all investigating the same problem. So for me, that's Antarctica, or climate change, or sea level rise, or mistrust in science. The conferences I get the most out of are when I meet with scientists, social scientists, other humanities scholars, Indigenous studies scholars, artists, communicators, all bringing our different perspectives and tools and practices and ideas to some gnarly problems. So I started presenting at interdisciplinary conferences and collaborating with colleagues from the natural and social sciences on journal articles, many of them with a focus on climate change communication. And some of this work here is from the New Zealand Sea Rise program that I was involved in for 5 years. But what really attracted me to the idea of being an academic was that it would give me time to write books. I had been to Antarctica twice on a media program in 2011 and with Cliff Atkins to film lectures for a new online course about Antarctica in 2014. And I'd written many magazine articles and blogs about it, but I had a lot more to say and a much more personal story to tell. So during my first sabbatical, I enrolled in a Masters of Creative Writing at the International Institute of Modern Letters here at Te Herenga Waka, and truly that was the best educational experience of my life. And while my writing was very personal, I also followed the work of a group of scientists who I spent time with in Antarctica, Nick Gollage, Tim Nash, and Richard Levy. I went to Antarctica again with Cliff in 2018. So the book, 15 Million Years in Antarctica, which has been called an eco-memoir, which I quite liked, covers these 3 trips and sometimes in between. And it was in this book that I got honest about the anxiety that has permeated much of my life, that was sometimes about something specific, like climate change or flying in a helicopter to a remote Antarctic field camp, but was really just there much of the time. And so I'm going to just read a little passage from from 15 Million Years in Antarctica. And this reading is from a chapter focused on the 2014 trip. And we're in a remote field camp in a place called Priestley in the Transantarctic Mountains. The guys are still planning the next day's fieldwork, but I need to be on my own. So I say my goodnights and head for my tent through the bright white of the blowing snow. The surface beneath the snow is dusty and brown, and every time I go into my tent, I track in a bit of 14-million-year-old dirt mixed with fresh snow. Getting in and out of the tent, which has a fly sheet over the top, is a mission. Because of the cold, I'm wearing my ECW boots, and I need to take them off before crawling inside. It's a one-person tent, and inside is my 3-layer sleeping bag, a down bag, inside a synthetic bag, inside a canvas bag, on top of my foam and sheepskin sleeping mats. Beside the bed, my clothes and books are spilling out of a large stuff bag. My pee bottle is in one corner of the tent, and my drink bottle is in another. Note to self, do not mix them up. I'm a messy traveller, and my tendency to fling things from one end of the tent to the other is not good here, as the mixture of dust from outside and moisture from melting snow is making things mucky. I wasn't expecting dirt in Antarctica. I strip off everything except my thermals, socks, hat and neck gaiter and get as deep into my bags as I can. Despite the time, it's after 9 p.m. and the falling snow, it's light. The sun won't set here for another 3 months, and there's a gentle orange glow inside my tent. It's cosy, and I usually cherish alone time, but I'm having trouble breathing, and I'm starting to panic. On my own in the tent, without any chatter around me, I acknowledge to myself that I really don't feel good. My head is buzzing, my chest feels tight, and my heart is palpitating. I can't breathe. So the COVID-19 pandemic made a lot of people very anxious, but while the pandemic itself was a source of anxiety for me, I felt very calm during our lockdowns. I was in the privileged position of having a salary and a house with a garden, close to the beach and the bush, and a dog to walk, so enough space for our family of 5 to feel comfortable. In a genuine crisis, people with chronic anxiety can sometimes perform quite well. In some way, I felt that at last the bad thing had happened, and I was prepared. Of course, I had been hypervigilant. Early in 2020, I was tracking the international news, reading what colleagues who worked in modelling, epidemiology, microbiology were saying on social media, and preparing. I slowly and quietly started stocking up on food, that is, not toilet paper, and our team already did a lot of online teaching. So we had a relatively easy pivot to working from home and teaching online. When Jacinda Ardern announced the lockdown, I felt a surge of relief. It was the right thing to do, and it showed that we could make massive changes at speed if needed. And so I wrote about the pandemic and climate change and our responses to both in an essay for Granta for an edition called Second Nature. And as part of my intense focus on the pandemic, I watched the daily 1 p.m. briefings during lockdown and later worked with a colleague, Alex Beattie, as part of a wider Te Punaha Matatini project to analyse the language used in the briefings, which we described as featuring open, honest and straightforward communication, distinctive and motivational language with military analogies and references and sporting analogies and references and expressions of care. And even though it's only 3 years old, this is now my most cited paper. Thank you, Alex. And 68 citations in 3 years, that's a good number for the humanities, to the scientists out there who might not be so impressed. And I also collaborated on this paper with Susie Wiles and Toby Morris to document and contextualise their work, making cartoons for the spin-off during the pandemic. But the pandemic brought new anxieties. In 2017, at a Te Punaha Matatini hui, Richard Arnold and I had proposed a research project which started with the question, how did things get so bad? And led to a project with the bland title of Science, Statistics and the Media, in which we would look quite broadly at Trust in Science in Aotearoa, with a focus on science communicated through news and social media. Things got worse, and by the time the funding came through and we were ready to start the project, it was 2021, we decided not to focus on the pandemic and the associated infodemic because things had got so heated and there were so many other people working on this by now. But it was relevant context to what we were doing. During the first years of the pandemic, while most of us were happy to follow our Prime Minister's advice to be kind and get vaccinated, there were others who didn't just oppose vaccine mandates and mask mandates, they doubted the reality of the COVID pandemic itself. There were some wild conspiracy theories around, including claims that the vaccine caused programmed cell death and was associated with nefarious plans by a global elite for a new world order with a one world government, which instead of sounding kooky, sounded strangely familiar to me. And I started thinking about the 1980s and the 2 years that I spent as a born-again Christian. And I realised I still had my teenage diaries from that period, and I wondered if I might be brave enough to read them, to see if what I'd been thinking and writing about, and using it as the basis for a piece of writing, might help me make sense of the way that things were now, and maybe empathise with people saying things that, as someone trained in science and who'd spent years as a science writer, made no sense to me. Then for my next sabbatical, I took a road trip down the west coast with my best friend Maz, with whom I'd shared this Christian experience. Along the way, I talked to locals. I'd been writing about science for more than 2 decades. I'd talked to scientists about climate change, biodiversity loss, natural hazards, and shared what they said with readers. On this west coast trip, I was reading Rebecca Solnit's book, Men Explain Things to Me, which is a collection of essays. And I was thinking about my work as a science writer and thought that title, Men Explain Things to Me, pretty much summed up my career so far. And so I wanted to do something different. Rather than listen to authoritative accounts, I wanted to hear from people who weren't scientists, who weren't the acknowledged experts, about the things that worried me: climate change, the pandemic, earthquakes. And I would listen to them respectfully and write it down. And behind all this, I was thinking about how polarised things had got in our society and how important it is that we step outside our usual circles, reach out to other people and be prepared to listen to each other. And more often than not, underneath what might sometimes feel like irreconcilable differences, we'll find some common values or concerns, a bit of shared humanity. So I took a tour of the Stockton coal mine. I interviewed the climate change denier mayor of Westland. I talked to people who worried about climate change but did not trust the COVID vaccine, and I wrote about it. When I told my children I was writing another book, they asked me if I was going to write a real book this time. That would be a novel. But no, this was another work of creative nonfiction. So in this book, End Times, I alternated chapters of the teenage story with the West Coast story and made connections between the two narratives. And beneath both narratives, the book's about friendship and belonging and Pākehā family history and community and trying to tease out why people believe what they believe, why some people might accept the scientific consensus on things like climate change or the COVID-19 pandemic, and some people frame these things in a totally different way and want to rely only on their own personal experience and observation and tend not to trust anything a scientist or a science writer might tell them. Richard and I have also been supervising 2 students. Zoe Brown has completed a master's looking at attitudes to climate change in a Canterbury farming community, and April Boland is doing a PhD focused on flat earth belief in Aotearoa. So I'm genuine when I say that anxiety has shaped my research. It's not just a gimmick to hold this lecture together. Today, the doomsday clock is at 90 seconds to midnight. We're in a time of deep instability and uncertainty about the future. You could say that with a career focused on thinking and writing about nuclear war, climate change, pandemics, and other horrors, it's no wonder that I have had issues with anxiety. But my anxiety has been there since I was a child. I've always had this sort of quiet hypervigilance that makes it very hard to relax. But now, despite all this, my day-to-day anxiety has reduced, or it's more under control. And I just wanted to say a little bit about why that is. It's not because things are better in the world, but a year or so ago, I was diagnosed with autism, what used to be called Asperger's syndrome, and ADHD, an attentive subtype, not the sort of hyperactive, impulsive subtype that you might be more familiar with. And I don't want to make a huge deal of this, but I do want to share it, to do what I can to destigmatise these neurodiversities, to help challenge stereotypes about what these conditions mean or look like. Like many women my age, I learned about neurodiversity from doing lots of online quizzes that told me I was probably neurodiverse, and from having children go through diagnoses and recognising that I had a lot of the same symptoms or challenges. Getting these diagnoses gave me a new framing for my responses to a lot of things that I found difficult, and blamed on what I called my shyness, introversion, anxiety. And with this diagnosis, my base level of anxiety just halved overnight. Rather than thinking I needed to take medication or to work on myself to deal with my anxiety, I recognised my limits and understood that in some ways my brain was just a bit different to most people, and some social situations or interactions were always just going to be a bit harder for me. I've also chosen to take stimulant medication for my ADHD, and that's further reduced my anxiety. And while I've always been very productive in my work life, maybe trying to overcompensate for worrying that I wasn't doing it right, I think that medication has helped me be more present and calm in my home and personal life, and a bit tidier and less inclined to lose things, which is good. So just while I have this platform, I'll expose a few myths about autism. Only autistic people are on the autism spectrum. It's not true that if you have autism, you lack empathy. Some of us have a sort of hyper-empathy, including for animals and objects, which can be quite exhausting. Autistic children grow up to be autistic adults. And yeah, unfortunately, I'm not a mathematical genius. But autistic people and those with ADHD can have an ability to hyper-focus on things they are really interested in. And for me, that's not maths, though I do like maths. It's researching and writing books, essays, articles about things that I want to know more about. And if there are no other demands on me, I'm happy to work a 16-hour day on something I enjoy. So if my anxiety has driven my research and my neurodiversity has driven my anxiety, it's really my neurodiversity that is responsible for the direction that my research has taken. And I tried to visualise how writing has been so important to me. Writing has always made me calm. It really feels like it's something I need to do to get things out of my brain. By putting my thoughts, feelings, experiences, learnings on the page and then shaping it into a narrative, it feels as though that is done, and there is now space in my brain for other things. And I'll just add that I've put a lot of preparation into this talk, but it's easier for me to stand up here and talk, a situation where I know the parameters and the rules and the format, than it will be for me to be part of the social function afterwards. But I'm really pleased to see you all here, and I know most of you, I think, and yeah, please join us for refreshments after the lecture. So where are we today? I wonder what Eric Hogsport would call the current age, the one that probably began about 2016, because we are very much not on the right track if we want a fair, peaceful and sustainable future for our planet and the species that live on and in it. My next book will be about the Antarctic ice sheet, but I wonder if there's something more useful for me to do. I'm 56, I think, so perhaps in the next decade or so of academia, rather than just letting my anxieties drive me, I'd like to think about what can I do to be most useful, not just to the university, but to the society that I'm part of, and more importantly, to the future. But instead of ending on a reflective downer, I want to end with something a bit more peaceful and calming. And being in nature and spending time with other people is something that we know is good for all of us. So I'm just going to do a short reading to end from End Times. and this is from the 2021 narrative. It's about 10 o'clock at night. Maz and I have been staying in a hostel in Hokitika at the location of what used to be called the Seaview Insane Asylum. It's pitch dark, and Maz and I have accepted an offer of a glowworm tour with a couple of locals. We start walking upstream, stepping carefully on rocks to avoid immersing our boots in the water and dodging low-hanging branches of mahoi and ponga. When Zeus starts barking and running in circles, I ask what he's found. "It's the freshwater cray. He thinks he can catch them, don't you, boy?" says Aidan. "Hold on," he says, and bends down and fishes around in the water. He lifts his arm, his sleeve dripping wet, and holds his hand out to us. Maz shines her torch on a crawly. It's like a tiny crayfish, maybe 10 centimetres long, a murky greeny-brown colour. It's squirming in Aidan's grip. "Put it back," I say, feeling concerned for the crawly. Aidan slides it back into the river, then points to a movement in the water. "A cave wetter," he says. "They can trap a bubble of air and take it with them underwater." "Sounds like you've been doing some research," says Jason. I wonder about his inflection of the word research, like it's a bad thing, something to be embarrassed or ashamed of. I'm pleased I'd introduce myself as a writer rather than a researcher or an academic. "Not research, observation," says Aidan. "I've seen it." I hold back on saying that observation, rather than reading things on the internet, is the basis of most scientific research. Now doesn't seem the time for a philosophical discussion on the nature of science. It's dark and it's cold, and I've no idea where the fuck we are. While Jason stops to roll a durry, Maz and I carry on up the stream, following the torchlight and the sweet smell of Aidan's caramel-flavoured vape. Maz, just ahead of me, flicks past a branch that swings back and hits me across the bridge of my nose. "Ow, fuck. Shit," she says, "sorry." There's a bit of blood, but I'm okay. I hold my hand over my nose and look around. On the banks either side of us are remnants of the old dump. An institutional chair, a bottle perched on a metal lawnmower, God knows what's buried beneath the dirt and the leaf litter. Jason, who has caught up with us, starts talking about overburden, rounded rocks, gold mining. He now works as a moss cutter, gathering sphagnum moss, but did a stint with an alluvial gold mining operation. He seems to know what he's talking about. Maz used to be a mining engineer, I offer, wondering if she's going to join the conversation, but no one responds. Perhaps they don't believe me. Where are we going? We continue up the stony stream, but now the cliffs either side of us are vertical, covered with dripping ferns and mosses. At the top of the cliffs, maybe 4 metres high, trees reach out over the stream, covering most of the sky. Through the gaps, we can see stars. We're commenting on what an amazing place this is, and asking Aidan how he found it, but we're thinking, when will this ever end? Are we just walking, or are we going somewhere? A subterranean cavern? A padded cell? Jason, who is now walking ahead of me, holds a branch back for me, and I decide that staying close to him might be our best chance of survival. He seems capable and trustworthy, chainsaw in one hand, beer in the other. "We're here," says Aidan, finally. We're at the end of the stream. Ahead of us is an ancient-looking stone wall, where water falls from a pipe and pools in a pond just a few metres across. We turn off our torches, and on the moss-covered vertical walls around us, thousands of pinpricks of light emerge, constellations of stars. We are surrounded by glowworms, more than I've ever seen, 10 times more than I've ever seen, like we're floating through space. We stand, heads tipped back, turning in slow circles, exclaiming, while Aidan vapes. I fill my lungs with the earthy damp air, the chuckle of the water, and the bright white stars against the black night, transporting me into a world where I'm at once deeply grounded and floating in space. I feel a connection with the river, the people I'm with, the planet I'm on, and give thanks for this moment, this place. That's why I do this kind of shit, I remind myself. It's almost always worth following a trail, saying yes to an adventure for what you might find at the end. And people are mostly good and kind and fun. I'm starting to miss this feeling even before it's gone. Jason turns on his torch and we gather close to the cliff to look at the sticky silk threads hanging from the walls. The glowworms attract insect prey with their lights, then trap them in their snares. When an insect lands on them, they pull the snare up and eat the insect. They thrive in caves, grottos, and deep gullies protected from the wind, where their snares can hang without getting blown about and tangled. You know they're not actually worms, don't you? Says Jason. We do know, but it feels less special when you know they're maggots, the larvae of a fungus gnat. The Latin name is Arachnocampa luminosa. The Māori name is Titiwai, meaning lights reflected in water. Ngā mihi nui kia koutou. Thank you for coming.
This is an enormous privilege for me, so thank you. Tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. I'm Professor Nikki Nelson, the Dean of the Faculty of Science, and I am just delighted to be able to do this thank you, this vote of thanks to Professor Rebecca Priestley for her wonderful inaugural lecture. Doesn't seem quite the words to cover it, Rebecca. I'd like to acknowledge the Vice-Chancellor, the University leadership at this event. I'd like to welcome Rebecca's family and friends. It's a pleasure to have you joining us today. I know it's one of the really unique things about these inaugural lectures that make them so special. We all know how valuable it is to have this enormous support network that we have as academics, and I especially want to acknowledge Rebecca's husband, Jonathan, and her children, all of them, not just the ones that are here, Pippi, Hazel and Huck. And as for the rest of the audience, thank you so much for coming out to support your colleague, friend, or person you're super interested in their work. And tonight we've been honoured to hear Rebecca examine issues such as New Zealand's nuclear history, climate change communication, and trust in science. We live in a time where, while the public have engaged strongly in scientific research, trust in science has been eroded, calling us to question and reflect how we have communicated, how we'll continue to communicate about scientific issues. As researchers, the topics we're passionate about can keep us up at night, but Rebecca's lecture highlights the importance of facing these issues head-on, personally, learning about them, and educating others in response to times of crisis and anxiety, and I would suggest perhaps even a solution to anxiety. As the Vice-Chancellor noted in his introduction, Rebecca is a valued colleague of ours in the Faculty of Science and in the foundation of the School of Science and Society. She's an enthusiastic and generous researcher and teacher. She's excelled in creating a really supportive and inclusive learning community. Her passion for science, the history of science, it's evident not only in her widely published books, but essays, articles, blogs, her leadership, and notably as a driver for the evolution of this new school that we have in Science and Society. Rebecca's ability to think creatively and strategically when solving problems and facing new ideas is truly inspiring. We're really lucky to have you as a member of our staff here. So before you clap, I would like us to say congratulations to Rebecca on a fantastic inaugural lecture. We're really proud of you. And I want to welcome you all to join us in a little something outside, which you've already indicated you'll be really happy to talk to us at. We're really proud of you and all the outstanding work you've done so far, and we look forward to what the next decade brings. So thank you very much.